Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to be venturing into the basement, because yesterday we had attics, and what could be creepier than exploring both parts of the house that we'd rather not? I hope you're ready for an interesting and spooky ride. As always, a huge thank you to my amazing patrons, and if you'd like to receive some, all, or more than these things that you see on screen as rewards, feel free to check out my Patreon, which is the link at the top of the description. It helps me out a lot. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Some stuff happened to me, but most of this happened to my brother. Really, the most that happened to me was that if I left the basement, like watching television to grab a snack, I would return and certain things would be out of place. For example, television remotes, dishes that would be left down there. Sometimes the remotes were 10 feet away from where they should be. And every time I'd go to my family to see if they had tampered with anything, the answer would always be no. Sometimes I would hear my name being called out, but dismissed that easily, because I could have been hearing things. I didn't worry about this all too much, because there were no worries behind it. I was always just dismissing it. Now here is where all the freaky stuff begins. My brother always told me stories of him hearing things, like his voice being called by my parents at 3 a.m. The two biggest events that happened to him were one when he was sitting playing video games in his room in the basement, and there's a sort of hallway/pull room that is before you enter his. While he was enjoying himself, on his right shoulder, he got really cold, and he made efforts to warm it back up, but it wasn't working. And when he swiveled his chair to the right and looked into the mirror, there he was facing the door, and he saw a shadow dart in or out of his room. And then on another time, he was hearing things outside of his room. So he gets up, goes to the bathroom, comes out, and he's growling behind our pool table. We do not have dogs. He craps himself and runs into his room and locks it. Shortly after he locks it, his door handle jiggles for about 30 seconds and then stops. Weirdly though, I am not that afraid of my basement, but at night, I do not enjoy being down there alone. Almost every night, I like to go into my basement for a night of playing video games with my friends. Normally the night goes well and I'm in bed by 1, but recently I have been hearing sounds in my basement, such as what I believe to be coughing and sometimes snoring. When I hear this, I immediately go up to my room and sleep until the morning. When I go back down to my computer, I am sometimes greeted with odd websites that I have never visited, and my initial thought was that I had a virus. I did a virus scan and found nothing. When this happened again 3 times over the course of 2 weeks, I completely wiped my hard drive of everything, and when I woke up in the morning, Google Chrome had been installed to my computer, and 30 tabs were open to various websites. But the strangest one was the FedEx website, telling me my package had been shipped. I didn't look where, but I regret it now. Almost 3 months had gone by, and I hadn't thought much about the situation other than the odd sounds, and I asked my friend to go into the basement to get something for me. I was surprised when he ran up the stairs as fast as he could, and what he said he saw next was enough to prompt me to call the police. He said he saw someone crawling out of the window well by the time he got down there, and all he saw was that person's legs. We ran outside to look for them, but there were no signs of them anywhere. We both assumed that they had gone into the woods about 50 feet from my house. When the police came, they found nothing out of the ordinary. The police left and my friend left 15 minutes later, understandably frightened by what he had just seen. For the next 2 months, I still heard these sounds and experienced scary and strange occurrences, like my downstairs shower being wet when nobody had used it beforehand. And one day, they all stopped, and I had a note on my desk written in Sharpie that said thanks for the stay. And that was the end of the situation. For the longest time, I thought the note was part of an elaborate prank. But now, I'm not so sure. With all the other stuff that's happened between all of that, and the fact that my family had all been asleep during these encounters to this day, I still have no idea who that person is, and don't really care to find out. The one and only paranormal thing that has ever happened to me was when I was around 14 years old, sitting on my couch in my basement alone watching TV. With no warning, I start hearing the slow humming noise directly to my left, inches away, and every hair on my left side stands on end. I don't know how, but I had the balls to stand up, walk, and turn off the TV without a remote, and walk up the stairs. All the while I'm about to OD on adrenaline. Nothing but a noise and a feeling. But I vividly remember repeating in my head, something is right next to me. I never had another incident after that one. I had my Nintendo Wii down in the basement for the longest time, and would spend hours down there. I was playing one night, and all of a sudden the TV and Wii turned off. I went to check the plug because it was loose sometimes, and can theoretically fall out if pulled. I wasn't pulling it to turn it off though, as I was gaming and not near the cords. I looked up from the cords as I was fixing it and saw a light grey mist in the air. I looked at it for a few seconds and then ran upstairs like the floor was on fire, and didn't go there for a while again. I have thought over it now that I'm older, and can't really see how a mist could just appear there. No leaking pipes to create moisture. No one in the house that smokes anything. The only person who smoked in my family was my grandfather, who had been deceased for a while at that point. I did have his pilot's vest hanging nearby at the time though. When I was a dumb kid, my brother and I were playing around on the stairs. I was at the top jumping around in a pillowcase. I slipped, obviously, and went tumbling down backwards. Everything went into slow motion, as things sometimes do when your life is in peril. As I was flipping over and over, the back of my skull getting closer by the second to smashing into the hard concrete basement floor, I notice a movement coming from the dark basement. Suddenly, a large bag of dog food flies across the room as if hurled by an invisible hand with absurd precision, and interposed itself between my head and the floor. My skull smashes into the bag a millisecond later, spraying kibble instead of skull fragments around the room. My brother and I were both slack-jawed and confused. The flying bag had travelled at least 10 feet, likely saving me from death or serious injury. I used to think this was evidence for God or angels, or that I have some kind of purpose, but I realize this is evidence for nothing in particular, except that life is bizarre and unexpected things can and do happen. I'd like to begin by saying that there have been many happenings in this house, but I will share the most frightening. The area where my house is was once open prairie, and we have found Native American artifacts laying around the area. When my parents divorced when I was a young teenager, my mother and I moved into this house. Now at first it seemed great. There was plenty of space, and it had a very cozy feel to it. However, as time went on, strange things began to happen. The more I noticed them, the more frequent they would become. I'd hear some walking downstairs as I was brushing my teeth, and would assume it was my mother, but whenever I'd check, no one would be there. Footsteps began to be a very common sound in my house, especially at night. So after some time, I came to the realization that, oh crap, my house is haunted. Now here's where things get really weird. One day, my good friend and I had just gotten done from being out in the sun and decided to retreat to my mum's house. Considering she had been away on business, we figured this would be awesome. My friend and I could go drink or do whatever mischievous activities we wanted to. We were wrong. We walked inside and headed straight for the basement, where it was cooler than the rest of the house. While walking down the stairs, I noticed that the Beatles' Yellow Submarine poster that was hanging on the bottom of the stairwell was tilted slightly to the left. No bother, I figured. It must have gotten bumped by me or something. I fixed it, and we walked into the main room. Mind you, we had pictures and posters hanging everywhere in the basement. What my friend and I saw creeped us out. All 10 to 15 pictures on these walls were each tilted slightly to the left, just as the Beatles once had been. But the weirdness of the situation didn't stop there. The storage room, which was essentially a dirt-floored room that was lifted about 4 feet off the ground, had its door cracked open. So I walked over to see a golden glow emanating out of it. There's a pull cord light located about 10 feet from the door that's turned on. I hop up and into the storage room, crawl on my hands and knees to turn the light off, hoping that all of this had a natural explanation. I called my mum and asked her about it, and she said she has no idea what I'm talking about and hasn't been to the basement for weeks, and to leave her on her trip. Shivers shoot down my spine. I look back into the storage room, and in the dirt there's a footprint. The most distorted and mangled footprint imaginable. I'm frozen in fear. My friend is too. Without the words, we look at one another, each feeling a sickening, gut-wrenching feeling. I slammed the storage space shut, locked it, and we bolted out of my house as fast as we could. I'll never forget how sickening and mangled that footprint was, and thinking that I had crawled in there to turn the light off still gives me shivers to this day. When I was 8 years old, my family moved to a new house. Both my parents worked pretty hard, and it was always just me and my sister, late into the evenings until my parents arrived, sufficiently drained and exhausted to give us the mandatory kiss on the cheek, dinner, and collapse on the couch. They were hard times. This house was a rental, but we liked it all the same. There was one part, however, that I did not enjoy, that being the basement. In truth, there wasn't a lot down there. Mostly just boxes with things that we didn't need or didn't need yet. Stuff that wouldn't look appropriate in our new house, as my mother said. We hardly ever went down there. There were few opportunities that required us to fetch things, except of course seasonal decorations and the like. I remember it must have been about July. We had been in the house for something like 8 months, and one day, as I'm passing the kitchen, I notice that the basement door is ajar. Now, even though none of us ever go in here, this didn't strike me as odd at first, and I simply closed the door and went about my business. A few days later, the same thing. This time, it's ajar, but nearly closed, almost looking like someone had made a hasty retreat and forgotten to close the door properly. I approached the door with curiosity, still resigning it to the normal and thinking that there was nothing wrong with this situation. I just opened the door slightly, peered down at the dark and foreboding steps, and then quietly closed the door with a creak. I closed it and went back to my room to do whatever I was doing. It was around this time that I also started to hear things. The TV room was located just above the basement stairs and door, with the kitchen on the other side, and the stairs sort of separating the two. As I was watching TV, it was an ad break, and I was listening intently. All of a sudden, I hear something. I turn the volume of the TV down and can make out the sound of footsteps as slowly and as quietly as possible, trying to make their way up the stairs. I quietly make my own way to the stairs, throw open the door, and am greeted with nothing. But I did hear the panicked sounds of heavy breathing, and perhaps the last 3 footfalls of someone hitting the solid wooden stairs and getting to the bottom. I was quite confused. I called my mum and dad to check it out, asking them to see if there was a man in the basement. But when they returned from their trip down, they told me that there was nothing that they could find. Keep in mind, I never explicitly told them what was down there or what was wrong, so when they asked me what was wrong, I said I thought I heard something and didn't elaborate in the details. They told me that it was probably just a rodent and to not worry about it. I nodded my head, agreeing with them, and carried on with my day. But the noises persisted. Infrequent as they were, I would hear shuffling, things moving about, and my fear of the basement only grew. I began worrying that our basement was haunted, that there was some dark entity living underneath our house. In a moment of bravery, I confronted my sister and asked her if by any chance she had heard or experienced anything unusual in the basement or heard things from it. Without missing a beat, she fills me in that she has been hearing creepy stuff from the basement, and as her room is opposite the basement door, she tells me that there are times when she's going to sleep that she hears footsteps, someone open the basement door quietly and make their way over to her room. She hears the door creak and then always hides under her blankets. I asked her why she never told Mum and Dad, and she said the one time she screamed for them, which I didn't know as I'm a very heavy sleeper, when they came in to investigate, there was no one there, so she didn't know if she was going mad or not. It was in this time that we, together, decided that we had to investigate. So when we got home from school that day, we grabbed a flashlight and a weapon from the kitchen. We descended the wooden stairs into the blackness, switched on the light switches, and turned on the flashlights for added protection. We scoped around the place, top to bottom, as best as a 12-year-old can do, I suppose, to check out what we could find. There wasn't much. We couldn't find any trace that the man was down here, leading us to believe there was a more paranormal element to our haunting. Just before we resigned ourselves to leave, did I notice something odd. Right by one of the boxes, there were a few things thrown about just outside, like someone had pushed it over and knocked the contents in a hurry. I walked over to look. It were the Christmas decorations. Weird, I thought. I put down a bauble and looked at my feet. And then, after moving the box slightly to the right, did I notice a trap door handle. Our basement was actually made of dirt, so the handle of a hatch was very out of place, very conveniently covered up so that no one would find it amongst all the clutter and a few bits that were left by the old house. We looked at each other, pushed one of the boxes aside, and considered looking down. My sister, being the bravest of the two, pulled the flap open quietly, as it was very creaky, and looked down into the abyss. That's when she saw a light at the very end, and a man talking to himself. He was being loud and rude, and my sister quietly and quickly closed the hatch as fast as she had opened it. She ran upstairs, called my mum and dad, and told them exactly what the situation was. She then called the police, who came extremely fast, even beating my parents, and went downstairs to arrest the guy. Turns out that underneath our basement, there are a few little tunnels that connects some of the shops and businesses around town. Naturally, these businesses had to seal their exits once they found them, and that was that. I don't know what happened to the man. Our parents refused to tell us, but I'm just glad he's gone from our lives, and we'll never have to see him again. This happened to me a number of years ago. An altercation between my parents and I left me without a home. Don't worry, we're cool now. It was all my fault. Definitely shouldn't have brought those drugs into the house, but being a stupid 18-year-old with no money, I was desperate. However, being kicked out of the house put me towards the straight and narrow. I had to find a job, as at the time, I was just sitting at home playing Xbox for most of the day, to the point that my parents' frustration grew immensely. This is why this story happened in the first place. I needed to get a job, and a friend of mine worked at a local movie theatre and told me that they always needed staff. Their turnover was something insane. So I got in touch, and within 3 days he was giving me an interview. I show up, and he smirks at me, and we both just laugh in the interview room. He asks me some generic, chilled out questions, and at the end says, "Yeah, Brian, you got the job." It was more the formality than anything. And by the end of the week, I have my uniform and my rota, and I'm going to be paid eventually. I actually moved in with him for a few weeks just to get off my feet, and we were having the best of times at the movie theatre. There's not that much work to do, to be honest. It was a small town, and the movie theatre was the only one in town. So it was popular during the weekends, but during the weekdays, there wouldn't be much going on, especially not during the day. Now, this movie theatre was old. Really, really old. I want to say about 1910 or something like that. Point being, we had this dark and eerie basement at the bottom that housed all sorts of old things. It was creepy, and it had those lights that take ages to turn on. I used to call them the stagger lights. We go down the stairs to the basement every once in a while to store old movie posters, cardboard cutouts and things like that might be helpful in future, or that we may use as giveaways and prizes to keep sales in the theatre and have people come back. We're good like that. Don't just throw them all away. In any case, our trips down to the basement were frequent enough to make me afraid of it. It was dark, a little bit damp, and smelled. It always had this strange sensation, like I was being watched in the dark. To explain, it was a very big, dark room, right underneath one of the main theatres, with huge supporting pillars. It looked like a car park nearly. It was that big. At the edge, there was a small booth with a glass window, I still have no idea what was supposed to be there. Was that security? In any case, we didn't actually have security. Point being, this was just a very creepy place. Lots of old things, old boxes, and stuff that people had for the most part forgotten. After a few months of working there, I had gotten into the routine. I was actually quite a good worker, and me and my friends got along excellently, and the theatre was doing great business-wise. It was on one of these days where I didn't have much to do that my boss comes up to me and asks if I'd like to do a bit of overtime. Me, being young and hungry for money, asked him exactly what this entails, and he leads me down the stairs to the basement when I get a pang in my stomach. Oh no. He tells me that he wants me to organize and dispose of whatever we don't need here, that I need to make a list of everything we have, organize it, so that he can go through the list and let me know what is to be kept and what is not. And once that's done, for us to then organize what's left. He said he wasn't sure how long this whole thing would take, but that he would like me to stay overtime or before my shift started, whichever was convenient for me, and try and do as many hours as it took to sort this out. The pay for doing this task was quite good, and the fact that he hadn't told me how many hours it would take meant that I could go as fast or as slow as I wanted to, which is nice because it was such a chilled environment. So I started early one Friday afternoon, got into the theatre around 8, and being the only person in there, went down to the basement. I started looking through the boxes, loads of old random stuff, magazines from the town that we were featured in, old posters, old merchandise, loads of things. I even found a really old projector, and I wondered if I could take it home if no one wanted it, or if it still worked. As I was going through the stuff, minding my own business, do I hear something from behind me? It was coming towards that funky little booth in the corner that I still didn't know what it was. I wondered if it could be a rat. I hate rodents of any kind, and didn't have anything to protect myself, so I grabbed the nearby broom and started quietly making my way over, seeing if I heard the noise any sooner. Just as I was about to reach that booth, do I hear a noise again, and I jump. It sounded like cans. Cans being stepped on or moved around. My head was hidden behind a pillar. As I composed myself, I moved over and peeked around the pillar. There was a pair of feet hanging outside the booth on the floor. I crept as quietly as possible to see who on earth is there. Was this one of my friends playing a prank on me? As I got closer, I saw the face of a disheveled-looking homeless man. He was asleep. He was twisting, and all around him were beer cans, monster cans, old food, packets of Snickers and stuff. My eyes opened wide as I realized that this guy was not supposed to be here, and quietly made my way out of there while running as fast as I could. When I reached the top, I called my manager, who I actually woke, and asked him if he knew that there was a homeless guy in the basement. He immediately sobered up from his sleep and told me to call the cops immediately. The cops arrived, but when they did, the man was gone. I think it was all the commotion. That's when we realized that at the back of the little booth, there is actually a secret hole that leads to one of the theatres towards the back, and then you can just go out one of the fire exits. It was incredibly weird and disturbing. My manager said he understood if I didn't want the task, but as I really needed the money, I told him to give me a week to get over it and that I'd do it anyway. It took a whole 3 weeks in order to complete the task, but the basement was looking good again, and we made sure to seal off this hidden basement door. We removed the booth, and everything was fine. I quit shortly after though, finding a better job in another town, one with a career, and tried to make something of myself. I am glad that these events happened, as it put me on the right path. But to the homeless man hiding out in the basement of the movie theater, let's never meet again. My sister had a sleepover with her friend this weekend. They were both down in the basement because the rec room was there. It's a pretty cozy room with an old Xbox, an easel for painting, some armchairs and comics. My sister and her friend often play around there by themselves, painting, playing Minecraft, usual 13-year-old stuff. We're used to them being alone down there, and our basement isn't seen as creepy or unsettling in any way. On Friday night, however, our evening got interrupted by the girls scrambling up the stairs, shrieking like a couple of bats out of hell. "There's something in the basement," my sister screamed. We figured they'd gotten spooked by a spider or something like that, so my parents went down to investigate. The basement was found empty. The girls were asked what all the fuss was about, and they told my parents the door handle to the basement began rattling so hard the entire door started shaking. I later asked my sister what all the yelling was about, and she showed me what had happened. It was like someone was trying to rip the door off, she told me, while grabbing the door handle and yanking it like someone trapped. It couldn't have been a draft, as the bathroom isn't connected to any of the outside walls, nor does it have any windows. They were laughing and giggling like crazy from the excitement of getting spooked like that, and we left it at being a weird but harmless occurrence. It did, however, remind me of something that I remember happening to me when I was a kid in that same basement. I must have been 8 years old, because I had gotten my own keys and was allowed to walk home on my own. I knew my parents were at work, so I unlocked the door and stepped inside. As I did, I looked at the basement door, and as I stepped in, I saw the door handle start to rattle and the door opening. I got so scared I bolted out of the house straight over to my friend's house, bawling my eyes out the entire way. Once my parents came home, and I told them what happened, they explained what a cross draft was, and how that's the most likely explanation for what caused the door to open. I believed it back then, but after this weekend, I'm not so certain. I'm 16 and live with my mum in our 2-story house with a basement. Now, our basement isn't creepy or anything. It doesn't even really look like there is a basement. From the front door of the house, there's a little walkway, and then a set of carpeted stairs that leads to an open door frame that in turn leads into the basement. The basement has 3 rooms in it, and a bathroom. There is my room, which is at the beginning of the hallway, and the spare room, which is right across from my room. Now, the hallway that separates our room is only maybe 100 to 200 feet long, if that, and is covered by that fake tile stuff that you can buy at hardware stores. If you walk down the hallway, you'll first come across an opening off to your right side that houses the water heater and the entry to the crawl space. It has a clothesline that goes across it to hang up any clothes that couldn't dry in the dryer. Continue walking, and maybe 20 feet later, you'll come across the bathroom, which will be on your left. At the very end of the hallway, it opens up into a bigger squared room that we call the playroom. Now that you've got the layout of the basement, onto the story. I've always felt as if there was something off about the house. I'd feel my eyes on me in my room, shadows moving in the corner of my vision, maybe hands brushing my back as I walk up my mum's room onto the uppermost floor to say good morning to her. I'd almost always brush it off, because these little things never seemed malicious to me. There have been 2 times, however, where I would feel something look at me that was more malicious. One time was last year, before we remodeled my room. We had just brought the paint, and I was getting ready to go to sleep. I turned off all the lights and climbed into bed, shutting my eyes. Something, however, compelled me to open them that night, and when I did, I saw a figure standing in the upper left-hand corner of my room glaring at me. That was the first time I felt utterly rooted to my bed by the terror that I felt and the hatred and anger oozing off whatever was by the corner of my room. But then I blinked, and suddenly there was no figure, just my old broom leaning against the corner. The maliciousness was gone, and I could feel I could breathe again. The second time was just tonight, about half-hour ago. I was getting water to fill up my fish tank a little, because the level had dropped. I had a pitcher that I was using to fill water up, and I had just filled it up in the bathroom down here, when I turned around and there it was again. The figure, standing only about 15 feet away from the entry of the bathroom, under part of the clothesline that spanned the area where the crawl space was. The anger and hatred I felt from that thing, the thing that was almost suffocating. I almost dropped the pitcher of water I was holding. I would have, if I wasn't paralyzed with fear. Within a few seconds I found my voice, and my brain managed to regain control. I screamed and stepped back. As soon as I did, the figure vanished once more. It took all I could to not run back to my room and close the door as quickly as I could. The thing was, this time I was shaking. I barely managed to dump the water into my fish tank without spilling it. I don't want to leave my room again tonight. I don't know if I'm just imagining these things, or if there is truly something in the basement that doesn't want me here. When I was about 4 years old, my parents and I moved into a new house in a really awesome neighborhood. Everything was going great. One night, my dad woke up to heavy knocking on our front door at 3 a.m. He went to see what was going on, and there were multiple police cars and a bunch of policemen standing around our house. My dad opened the door and asked the officers what was wrong. One of them said, "Sir, I need you to bring your wife and child, if you have one, downstairs. Then I need you to step outside with these officers here." My dad had no idea what in the world was happening, but he went upstairs and woke up my mum and I. When he brought us down, the officers sat my mum and me on the couch and started asking some super weird questions. "Does your husband ever hurt you? Has he ever made you feel helpless? Have you ever gone into your basement to get away from him? Does he ever lay hands on you or your child?" All stuff like that. My mum was shocked and of course said no to all of it. My dad would never do something like that. The policemen with flashlights and guns came in and asked to search our house. We said yes because we were honestly freaked out at this point and no one was telling us what was going on. They walked around our house and then asked to see our basement. Our basement is not finished, but it is quite large and super creepy. I hate it so much. No one ever goes down there, and we keep it locked. My dad unlocked it, and they searched it and were calling out stuff like, "We're here to help, please come out." They couldn't find anything of interest and came back upstairs. Then my dad told them that we deserved to know what was going on. One of them said, "Nothing seems to be the matter here, so I guess it's fine to tell you." We received a call from a woman who was in hysterics. She was screaming and crying, saying that her husband was going to finish her. She had barricaded herself in her basement to get away from him. My dad was spooked and said, "Well, why would you come to our house?" The officer said, "We traced the call to your house, and that is why I hate my basement so much more than I already did. Our neighborhood is very old, and so is our house. So maybe it's a ghost or something. We still don't know what happened that night, but I do know that sometimes weird stuff happens in my basement. It has a door to the outside that we keep locked, but I've even been outside and seen it swing open. We even use stuff like deadbolts, so that's fun for us, I guess." My dad's job requires him to go inside people's houses. He has been in thousands of apartments and homes, so I asked him what was the weirdest and creepiest thing he has ever seen or experienced. My dad arrived early to this apartment complex around 7 a.m. because he had to go through every apartment doing some maintenance starting from the basement. He entered a laundry room located in the basement, where a man was in his 50s, wearing a nice white shirt and tie, suit pants but no shoes, and he had a green tarp in his hands. He thought it was kind of weird, but just ignored it since it's not his business. Later that day, he left to a local coffee shop to spend his break, and when he came back to work, there were police cars surrounding the area. Out of curiosity, he asked one of the police officers what was going on, and it turns out a homicide was committed. Dad then asked if what he saw was related to the crime, and it was. After the police interrogation, they told him that the man without shoes stabbed his mother to death in the bathtub, wrapped her in a tarp, and dragged her outside. The police caught her dragging his dead mother in the backyard. Of course, they didn't let my dad do his job in the murderer's apartment until after a proper investigation. A while goes by, and Dad gets to go there and finish what he's doing. He felt really uncomfortable doing plumbing and other maintenance in a house where someone had just been brutally finished off, especially in a bathroom, in a bathtub full of dried up blood. I'm pretty sure that my basement is bigger than the house itself. With that, there is a good amount of stuff down there. The stairs are in the middle of the basement and leads to the left side of the basement. On the right side, opposite the staircase, is where the washer and dryers are. This is where my story takes place. Every time myself or my dad's girlfriend goes down there to do laundry, we get this very, very strong feeling of being watched. It's not so malicious, but it's freaky. I have a look over my shoulder every 10 seconds because I'm so sure someone is looking at me, but every time I look around, there's no one. Most times I have to bring my dog down with me so that I have some comfort. Even my female dog gets shaken up about being down there. I should note that I used to sleep in the basement of about 3 or 4 months, and I never got that feeling. I feel a bit of hate and resentment when I'm down there, but it's not strong like the feeling of being watched. It really was starting to freak me out, to the point where I can't even step foot on the concrete floor anymore. I started doing my laundry, and then closed the top of the machine, and as it started, I was walking away. I then heard this high-pitched scream in my ear like a little girl, like something pretended to be one. I froze for 10 seconds and bolted up the stairs, and just was at the top of the stairs ready to close the door when I heard another high-pitched scream at the bottom, and it was ascending. I have no clue what to think anymore. I'm just really scared. I've even brought my dog down with me if I have to go down there. I just can't stand it. When I was very young, I lived in a house which was very old. I think it must have been at least 70 years old. I loved that house so much, except for the basement. I always hated the malevolent vibe that was ever present in the air down there. It felt evil, and I don't mean that lightly. I always felt like a pair of cold eyes were watching my every move, waiting to strike. I got the worst vibe from the room at the end of the hallway. Yes, a hallway in a basement. There was a small room at the end of the hall. The air there was thick with dread. It felt like something would lunge out at me at any moment. The only time I voluntarily went into the room was when there was a tornado warning. While in that room, I vividly remember feeling an awful force from the top right corner. I never dared to look away from the corner, even to find comfort by leaning into my mum for fear of whatever was lurking down there. I only recently found out from an old neighbor who had lived in the house beside us for a very long time that the last owner hung himself in that very corner of the basement. I was shocked when I heard that. Very little else was mentioned about him. One other previous owner also did the same thing in my old closet. I remember that it used to freak me out being in there, but thinking back on it now, I never felt the same feeling of dread that I did then while I was in the basement. So maybe they didn't want to hurt us. I don't think the same can be said for the other one though. It has been at least 10 years since I was last in that house, and even if I were to go back, I would not set foot in the basement. When I was 18, I was attending university and renting a room in an old house a few blocks off campus. Only one other room in the house was rented, and the girl who lived there spent most of her time at her boyfriend's place. I basically had the entire house to myself. I would estimate that it was built sometime between 1910 and 20, based on the style and neighborhood, but I could be wrong. I do know that it was about 100 years old at the time, and the oldest home I'd ever had. It was my first time living alone, and since it was such a big empty space, I spent most of my time in my room behind a locked door. It wasn't super creepy or anything, but at night when I was alone, I tended to avoid leaving my room unless absolutely necessary. It had the same uneasy feeling of turning off the basement light and then running up the stairs as fast as you could in the dark. Not for any real reason, but it made your heart race anyway. Near the end of my first semester, I contracted influenza A. I'd been pretty fortunate with my physical health up until then, and it was the sickest I'd ever been in my life. I could barely peel myself out of bed to go to the bathroom or to feed myself. I was incredibly weak, my whole body ached, and I was running a very high fever. I actually developed arthritis in my joints as a symptom, which I didn't even know was possible. I remember waking up with a puddle of sweat collected in the hollow of my throat at one point. It was absolutely disgusting. A few days into the ordeal, I woke up to find an elderly man sitting by the side of my bed. There was no chair there, but he was very obviously in a seated position. For some reason, I didn't react with shock at all. I was completely unafraid. I asked him what he was doing there, and he simply said, "I just wanted to make sure you're okay." I must have fallen back asleep because that's all I remember from the visit. This could have easily been a NyQuil-induced dream or a fevered hallucination, but to me it was absolutely real. He was there, he spoke to me, and I felt very comforted by his presence. A few months later, I had a friend of mine from another school come visit for the weekend. We did some exploring of the house and found a hatch to the basement. It was filled with old tools and hardware. But one thing that stood out to me for no apparent reason, on the wall was a medicine cabinet absolutely stuffed with old pill bottles, regular things like Anisin and other old brand names that I had to look up. It also contained many prescription pill bottles that were too faded to read. For some reason, as soon as I saw them, my elderly visitor came to mind. I wondered if maybe he had some experience caring for a sick relative and came to visit me when I was ill because it was a familiar situation. I did ask the landlord about previous occupants, but they had purchased the house only a few years earlier and didn't know much. I suppose I'll never know. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's ventures down to the basement, somewhere I'm sure many of us would rather not go. If you like the video, as always, please feel free to drop a like, comment, subscribe, and press the bell to be notified every time I post. If there's a story that you would like to share, feel free to send it to my email or post it on my Reddit page. That info can be found in the description. If you would like your name at the very end, like right now, feel free to join my Patreon for a whole load of awesome rewards. And a huge thank you to all my patrons. You're all amazing and mean the world to me. And I'm very grateful for your support. Thanks, guys. But with that being said, it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.